Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Gautam from Startup India, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second part of our live series on raising your first round of funding with Sequoia Capital. In the first session last week, we discussed how to lay the groundwork. How do you do the hard work to ensure that you're ready for the first round of funding? And today, we're going to take you to the next level and actually address what happens when you meet the investors and how do you pitch what you've built over so many years, your idea, to an investor. Over to Rajan and Peter.
Thank you, Gautam. Hi, everyone. Hope all of you are having a safe Saturday afternoon. As Gautam mentioned, welcome to the second session we are having in this four-part webinar series focused to help seed stage founders both first understand and hopefully over time be more successful or go through the journey of raising their seed round faster, easier, and hopefully with more success than they would otherwise. I'm pleased to be here again. Hopefully, those of you that were able to dial in last Saturday, 4 p.m. same time, were able to get some insights out of it that'll help you in both your company building, but also in your fundraising. So this is the second part of it, and I'm delighted to have Peter Kemp here with us. I'm going to introduce him to you in a minute. Peter is going to be leading us through most of the discussion today. Before we get into the quote-unquote pitch, so today what we'll talk about is what should you really have in your pitch and the do's and to-dos and not to-dos in your pitch. I wanted to recap again, how this came about. This is actually a very exciting partnership between Startup India and Surge. All of you, I know we've got quite a number of you that are going to be watching from outside of India, from South Asia, as well as Southeast Asia. But for those of you that are in India, you're well aware of Startup India. Startup India was launched by our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi in January of 2016 and is focused on helping accelerate the startup ecosystem in India and has been extremely effective, right, on many dimensions on helping shape policies that actually enable and encourage entrepreneurship in India, creating a large amount of infrastructure, especially around incubators, accelerators, things like that, as well as many enablers. One that I have been quite excited about for quite some time is the 10,000 crore fund of funds that was set up by the government of India in partnership with SIDBI. Now, in fact, I had the good fortune of being on the committee that actually looked at funds, and that actually was focused on encouraging the creation of lots of India-focused local venture funds, and we've had many dozen funds that have been created thanks to the help that the SIDBI Fund of Funds has created. If you go back to 2010, those of you that are in India know we had less than 1,000 startups in India. We had less than $500 million of venture capital, and we had 0 unicorns in India. And if you look at the end of 2019, we had over 40,000 startups, over 30 unicorns, and last year India had $14.5 billion of venture capital, and I can safely say that we have the most progressive government when it comes to focusing on the startup ecosystem in India. So firstly, I want to thank the Startup India team. You just saw Gautam who kicked off the session. There's a terrific team at Startup India that is focused on helping startups. So this is a partnership between Startup India and Surge. So now let me tell you a little bit about Surge. Surge is Sequoia's program that was launched in March of 2019, so about 16 months ago, and it is focused on helping seed stage founders and startups, accelerate their progress, right? By giving them enough capital, by helping them on all aspects of company building and giving them access to networks that they would otherwise not have, so that they can really build enduring companies. And it was founded, as I said, only about 16 months ago, but we've been very, very fortunate to have this program really take shape over the last 16 months or so. Both Peter and I are from Sequoia, but are really from the Surge team at Sequoia. And over the last 16 months or so, we've had 52 startups that have been funded from Surge, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And total of about 110 founders. So we have now a sizable community. 80% of these companies also have co-investors. So we have an open architecture model where we co-invest with others. So 80% of the companies that have been in Surge also have investments from other companies. By the way, so every company that comes into Surge, we give them we invest $1 to $2 million in each company before they start the program. And then we work with these companies over a period of 14 weeks on all aspects of company building. We start with mission, vision, then we go on to product, specifically starting, focusing on product market fit. Then we help them think through how to build their product teams, their engineering teams. Then we go on to sales, marketing, and so on and so forth. And in fact, last week, we actually had a session, a whole day focused on pricing and monetization. So essentially think of it as all the different aspects of how do you build not just an early stage company that's going to be successful, but how do you build an enduring company? And then we work with each of our founders very closely on helping them actually, whether it's hiring, whether it's thinking through their product strategy, and so on and so forth. So we are currently in our third cohort of Surge. We have 15 amazing companies from across both Southeast Asia and India, and we are quite excited about this program. We have invested, as Surge, invested over $100 million in the startups in our three cohorts, cohort 1, cohort 2, and cohort 3. And outside of this amount of capital, our startups in the first and second cohorts have raised an additional $250 million after they've actually come out of the Surge program, right? And I want you to keep in mind that this is a program that's only about 16 months or so after we launched it, because we launched it in March of 2019. So far, the progress has been very strong, but it's early days. We are also a startup, but we are humbled to see the kind of amazing founders we've been able to partner with. So this series that we're running is a partnership between Startup India and Surge. And the reason we thought we would do this is, as we looked at the ecosystem, there were a large number of India, as I said, has over 40,000 startups. If you look at all of Southeast Asia, there's probably an equal number of startups in Southeast Asia. The reason we did this was to really help seed stage founders gain a much deeper understanding of the seed stage fundraising process, right? So fundraising is not the objective, as I had mentioned in the webinar last week, but for those founders that need to raise funding, we wanted to sort of demystify and decode the process of seed stage funding. So that's really what Surge is. If you go to the next next slide. This is a 4-part series. Last week, we actually spent an hour and a half on a number of things that you should be figuring out before the pitch. So we covered things like when do you raise your seed round, who do you reach out to, how much do you want to raise, and also focused on what do investors want. I hope that I don't know how many of you who are dialing in for the live stream today were able to join us last week. But if you didn't join us last week, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It's only 90 minutes, but I think you'll get a lot out of it. We talked extensively about, firstly, we started off with this notion of, fundraising is not the objective, right? The objective is to build an enduring company, and many, many examples of companies that have built extraordinary companies, either with completely bootstrapped or raising very little capital. But if you do want to raise funding, we shared a whole set of frameworks and very specific tips and practical methodologies that you could apply to think through all the questions that you have in terms of what's the right time to raise, how much should you raise, who should you reach. We shared a lot of the different sources of funding that you can go to for seed stage funding. There's especially in countries like India, Indonesia, and others, there are many, many sources that you can go to, and then spend a lot of time on what do investors look for and what do they want when they actually look at a seed stage round. So that's what we did last week. Today is really all about the pitch. And Peter is going to walk us through everything from how do you craft the perfect pitch, why is your story important, and what do investors really look for in your important, as well as some very practical tips of things that you should do and not do as you focus on your pitch, right? So today is the second session in our 4-part series, and today we are going to, again, we started at 4, we'll go till 5:30. We will continue this both next Saturday as well as the Saturday after that. So if you go to the next slide, next week, we'll actually have 2 practitioners join me to talk about stories from the trenches, right? And these are very, very active seed stage investors. Obviously, Surge is a very active seed stage investing firm. I'll be there from Surge. to moderate a discussion with two others. One is, and I'll tell you at the very end of the session, we'll tell you who the two other investors who will join me, where we're going to really get into the nitty-gritties and share some real life stories of what investors look for, right? So we thought it'd be good for you to get a sense, not just from a seed stage a program like us, but also from angel investors, from individual angels, from funding platforms, and so on. And then finally, 2 weeks from now, so next week is going to be stories from the trenches, and 2 weeks from now, we're going to focus on after the pitch, right? What should you look for in a seed stage term sheet? Actually, a lot of founders don't really know what they should look for. So we thought we'd demystify that and give you a heads up, and so that when you actually get to that stage of getting a term sheet, what should you look for, and also what you should look for, what you should expect when you get into financial and legal due diligence, right? So we actually do large number of diligences given the number of companies that we invest in, both as Sequoia and Surge. But what we find is, especially at the seed stage, when we get into, after we sign the term sheet, after the founders sign the term sheet, as we get into financial and legal due diligence, we find that there are a lot of things that really aren't done. So we thought it'd be helpful for us to share that with you, so that you can start putting those things in place, so that you're not scrambling, after you sign your term sheet to get all those things done. So that's really the 4-part series, and we're hoping that number one, you joined us last time. If you haven't, please do take a look at the recording. Otherwise, I hope that you're going to have a great session today. I know that we've tried to put together some very, very powerful content that we hope will be helpful. And please do join us for the next 2 weeks as well. Saturday at 4 p.m. Brought to you from Surge and Startup India. So now let's get into the pitch. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce my colleague and partner, Peter Kemp. Peter has been with Sequoia for the past 6 years, is now a full-time Surge team member, much like myself. We've got now actually a sizable team that we're all very, very excited about. Peter he's been investing in startups primarily in Southeast Asia, as well as global startups for over 6 years. Is deeply familiar with and experienced in a whole set of industries that range from SaaS, a lot of SaaS investments, to fintech companies, to direct-to-consumer companies, as well as sort of consumer internet companies, right? And he's on the boards of many companies like Insider, which is a very, very exciting SaaS company, fintech companies, and as well as companies like Zenium, which is a very, very exciting direct-to-consumer company. So Peter is a very seasoned investor, but that's actually not all. Peter started his professional journey as a startup founder. So he was a founder, much like many of you, and then worked at a number of tech companies after that, and then spent a fair bit of time at Amazon, where he was at Amazon Web Services. So we are at Surge very fortunate to have Peter, because he's sort of got this unique combination of having been a founder, having actually been in large, very successful tech companies like Amazon, and also has now a lot of experience as an investor at Sequoia, and now with Surge. And as you can imagine, when you've done all of that over the last 6 years, Peter's probably seen thousands and thousands of pitches. So we thought there'd be nobody else better to actually share with all of you what should be in the pitch than Peter. So with that, Peter, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Rajan, and welcome everyone to this session. Again, hope you enjoyed the previous one, and we'll enjoy the next ones. The pitch, let's dive in. I think the interesting thing is lots has been spoken about how to pitch. And even though within Sequoia, we've been investing for a long time, and myself for the last 5-6 years, as Rajan mentioned, there is necessarily no right and wrong. And what we're presenting today is not like the only single source of truth, but a view of what we think is important and what we care about. In many cases, it is broadly the things that investors look for. And think about it as our recipe, but not the only recipe. I think that's important. We've learned a lot of things, but we're continuously learning, and know that there's no single right way. What we're going to talk about today is what we call the anatomy of the pitch. So what should be in there? What are investors looking for? How do I structure that, etc.? That will be 70-80% of what we'll talk about today, and then we'll finish with some practical do's and don'ts. And there's simple mistakes or simple best practices that are just useful to know, and we'll end with that. But as mentioned, we'll first start with the anatomy of the pitch deck, and we'll go into quite some detail. So if you think about it, as I mentioned just now, in general, not just Sequoia, but many of our co-investors and others, they look for certain things when they are evaluating a startup, right? And so there could be multiple ways in which you structure your deck, in which you make it flow. There's lots of unique decks that deviate, but there's a couple of things that you always want to be talking about, that you always want to present, where you want to demonstrate your understanding. And you can almost think about it as different building blocks that could be structured in different ways. And again, this is one flow, the unique one for those that are observing, and I'll talk a bit about that later, the importance of storytelling, and in this case, changing with a broader dynamic of what is changing in a market, what is the inflection point or the shift that is actually creating the opportunity. Within Sequoia, we often talk about the why now, right? Many other elements here you will have seen before. What is the pain or problem, the product, business model, etc. If you take a step back, what you'll see is that the first piece is actually the why. Like, why is there an opportunity? Like, why is it now? Why are certain customers underserved? Why are there shortcomings in the current solutions, right? It starts with that, like making people, like we often talk about it as selling the problem. If you sell the problem, then only then people will realize that a solution is needed. So you start with why, like, why is it that we're doing this, right? You then talk about what is it that we're building? And it's not just what in terms of product, but also business model and how you're doing things. Once you've done that, people want to know how you're doing. So how is it going? What is your progress? Is there product market fit? Are the economics working? Is there engagement? Things like that. Again, we'll talk about in more detail. At any stage, not just at seed stage, you can do a fantastic job in the why, the what, and how you're doing. But if you can't grow from there, if there's no future, if there's no upside, you have a challenge. So you then want to be talking about, like, what is the future? What is the vision? What will we be building? And in what market? And why do we think that we can outcompete competitors, direct and indirect, in that market? And obviously, when you execute on that, when you execute that future, who's going to execute that, right? So you want to be talking about that team. So again, think about those as the building blocks. Some people prefer to start with the team. Some people prefer to talk about market earlier. Again, there is no right and wrong. There's multiple flows that are possible. This is just one of them. But all the things that we'll be talking about are normally things that people care about as investors, and that from an audience point of view that you present to should be things you cover. Okay, so let's dive in each of these. The first, and it might be super simple, right? But what we thought about for today, it's good to go back to the basics and think about this. And why we say this is we often see a title slide and people go into a market and they go into all sorts of things, but 15 minutes into the deck, you're still wondering, like, what are these people doing, right? So don't leave people guessing. Define your company in a single sentence. And that is actually harder than it looks. Like, this one is really simple. This other example is already a bit or not too, but it's slightly longer. But there's often a risk of getting caught up in listing your features. That's not what you should be doing, right? It's still, like, here it's about empowering people. Like, how do you help them achieve their goals? And so say what you're doing in a single sentence. What I'll be doing throughout this session, by the way, is I'll talk about, for each of the 10 topics that I talked about, I'll have the basic, and I have a 201. There's a 101 and a 201. In other words, this is the advanced. If you really want to excel, you not just talk about that one declarative sentence, but you also share your mission and vision. Tilio is one of the search companies in Vietnam that was very strong in laying out that vision and mission very early on, and it really helped, like, when we first met them, to really understand what they're here to do and why, right? Maybe one good thing to mention, I mentioned earlier the 10, right? You can think about that as 10 slides. Some people say that your seed deck should be just 10 slides. The reality is that it's super hard. So think about it as 10 topics. Some of these things you'll be able to cover in one slide. Some of them will be a bit longer. In a seed deck, 15, 16 slides, at least from my point of view, again, different investors have different views, but my view is that's okay. Don't go over 20 slides, but sticking to 10 only is quite hard, as you'll see, because there's lots of stuff to cover. And so one of the things that we'll talk about in the end as well is it is extremely important to be articulate. right? How can you say a lot of things in few words, in few slides, and realize that not everything should be on the slide? But we'll get to that later. So first, title. Second, the main question in an investor's mind is not just like what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And that why can be answered in a very small sense because there's a small problem here or a small issue there. But what's much more interesting if you can tell a story that is much broader than that. And when you tell a story, you have to introduce tension. Every story, thrives on tension. And so the tension is a change. What is happening in the world that is changing? Is there a certain threat or an inflection point or a breakthrough? Is there a certain opportunity? Or is there maybe a tension because there's an asymmetry in the market? And that allows you to actually paint a picture before you get to the problem. It allows you to paint a picture that is much bigger and broader and will most likely capture a lot more imagination in your audience than just diving in with boring stats on market or on problem. Those are super important, but they might not be the hook that excites your audience in the most way. And so that market asymmetry is very interesting. And like here's an example that I think is really interesting. Pencil is actually a Search 3 company that is delivering creative AI. What they said is, hey, it's actually interesting. If you look at what contributes to the effectiveness of a digital ad, it is actually creative, right? As you can see here, it adds up to about 64%. But market cap creation does not follow that same 65% versus 35%. Like reach and targeting, which you do on Facebook and Google, that's where the market cap is going. And in a way, that is an asymmetry. And they then go into talking about what's driving that, the lack of AI, the lack of scalability, the lack of tech versus the advertising agencies that are less scalable and more manual. But they were leading some of their conversation with this asymmetry so that people say, hey, something is wrong here, and what can we do about that, right? So when you talk about what has changed, you also actually get into the why now, as I mentioned. So what has changed, 201 is why now? Can I point at the shift in user behavior or step change in adoption? For example, like Zoom was already being used, but post-COVID, adoption has gone up massively. Regulatory changes, an inflection point in technology. For example, a lot of things were done before, but now with AI reaching a certain maturity, things are changing. Or when you started seeing like 10 years ago, and obviously I used to work for AWS, but the boom in what some people call the Cambrian explosion in startups was driven largely by AWS and later on other cloud players that actually lowered the cost of building a startup, where in the early days you needed 5 or 10 million just to buy servers to get going. With AWS, that cost structure dropped, and so there was an inflection point. And so that is actually really important. And a company like Katabook talking about 60 million merchants, but what is the change here? They're actually coming online for the first time. And that allows them to start doing things that before that they couldn't do in a digital way. And when you start talking about the why now, you're basically talking about what are different factors that are coming together and put your company at the center of a convolution of different dynamics. So here they talk about now these micro SMEs suddenly have connectivity. There's regulatory tailwinds like UPI and demonetization, etc., as well as them becoming more tech savvy. Right, like 10 years ago, many of these types of merchants didn't even have a mobile phone. But now with a mobile phone, with data, with them using Facebook and starting to understand technology and the use of it, suddenly it opens up for what Katabook is doing. So that why now is super important. Normally, that change in the market leads to a pain. It creates either an opportunity or a pain. And you have to be able to really understand that deeply. And we speak about that in a second. But if you think about it, later on in the flow that I mentioned at the beginning, the anatomy of the deck, you can talk about market size, etc., early on or later, which I'm suggesting here. But understanding the pain point is sometimes the pain point of a user, but often also in a market. And Telio is a B2B marketplace primarily for FMCG goods to the equivalent of the Kiranas in India, but then in Vietnam. And so what they describe in terms of the pain is at the market level, the pain is fragmentation, right? But at the individual merchant level, like they describe the pain in more detail, right? Multiple suppliers, intransparent pricing, inflexible delivery, all sorts of challenges that they have to deal with, and that are basically ripe for disruption and are there to be improved by the right platform. That's the basic. But if you really want to do it well, and we actually love companies that show that they can deeply understand the customer. So show that you understand your customer. There is a framework around that called jobs to be done, but it's basically understanding what your user needs to do. What is the action or activity that the customer is trying to do, either in a B2B environment or in their B2C environment? What are their behaviors? What are the pains that they're experiencing when they are behaving in that way, or when they're executing these jobs to be done? What are the gains that they're seeking? And truly understanding that deeply allows you to understand the problem and sell the problem much better. And you might have one target market, but very often there's different personas in there. And so there's one company in Search 3 called Atlan, which is basically building a platform for data teams to work together. And they realized that data teams have different people. So they looked at the personas. You know, there's Alex the analyst, there's Aaron the engineer, there's Dalia the data scientist. And they really started looking into, like, these are all people that are all personas that are experiencing the problem, but perhaps from a different angle, or perhaps there's a slightly different thing that they find important. And they started looking into that and summarizing that into what their challenges are specifically, right? In the admin, there's dependency, I have to live with it. There's certain quotes there, like Larry, the data lake owner, like, I'm frustrated, business keeps demanding insane outcomes, but et cetera, et cetera. So it's really about understanding that deeply. And that's true in a B2B environment, but also in a B2C environment. Another Search 3 company, CoLearn, is an online learning platform. And they went quite deep and started looking at different user personas, right? Often you get quotes, you give them a name to make it personal, they describe it in a nutshell, they indicate the pain points, the blockers, but also how they use technology, for example, right? So you want to understand, like, what gadgets they're using, what apps they're using, and, you know, describe these different people, right? This guy's 15 years old, he's struggling and unmotivated. This guy is unmotivated but achieving. I'm not sure how you can pull that off, to be frank, but apparently Chandra is pulling that off. And so they really showed, when they presented this, that they truly understand their users and have been thinking about that. And then in your product design later on, you can actually start addressing that, right? And that's the main point. You don't understand the customers for the sake of it, but it helps you to build a product that meets their needs and ultimately allows you to demonstrate product market fit, right? Let me just pause there for a second and see if there's any questions so far, by all or anyone else.
Hi, Peter. We are good to continue.
Good to continue?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Then we'll do that. Cool. So, as I mentioned just now, why you want to understand your customers deeply is because you ultimately have to build a product that they like and that they value. And one of the things that we've noticed is that actually it is often quite hard for founders to really articulate that problem with absolute clarity. That product with absolute clarity. And often as a founder, you're deep into the weeds, you're building all the time. And for you, a lot of things are logical, but for an outsider, they might not be as logical. So how do you describe the features? But also, how do you, let's say, bundle them in such a way that you can show a structure or an architecture of those features that makes sense, right? And you easily think about that in a B2B environment, in a SaaS or a deep tech environment when you use a word like architecture. But even just product bundles or the value that they deliver, the worst thing that you can have is instead of a product, there's a whole list of features, but when to use what and how they hang together and how they combine is often not that clear and vague, and you want to avoid that, right? So be able to articulate very clearly the features that you have, be able to understand and communicate how they hang together. Also talk about how they're unique, right? And differentiated, because there might be other products in the market, very likely there will be. So you have to be able to explain how you're different, right? Unique and differentiated. In other words, why you? Like, why should a user invest time in you or money in you? Even if you're free, your user needs to go to the app store if it's an app, needs to download it, needs to put in their username, etc. And there's some level of friction that you can never avoid, right? And so you have to be able to explain that. And often that is around like being able to have a very clear value proposition, right? It's always good to think about features and benefits, right? The features is what you do, but the benefits are the value that they get from that. And if you go back to the user personas that we spoke about just now, the values are normally, the pain that you solve for them, or the gain, the objectives, the goals that you help them achieve, either of those two or both, right? So being able to explain that in a simple manner is important. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. There are several formats for a value proposition. A simple one is like, we help X to do Y by offering Z. So for example, let's say you're a software company for inventory management. We help small merchants make more money with our easy to use software or inventory management software. You can also make it slightly more detailed where you think about where you want to encompass basically your target customer, what their need is that we spoke about earlier, the product that you're offering, and the statement of benefit, right? So if the previous one, if you expand on that, you basically say, for small merchants who lose revenue opportunities due to lack of inventory, our company's easy to use inventory management software helps simplify operations, avoid stockouts, and generate more money. Again, it's just an example, but you clearly see the value statements at the bottom: simplify operation, avoid stockouts, and generate more money. The problem was losing revenue opportunities due to lack of inventory. So it's very, very simple, but it encompasses a lot. It encompasses your customer, their problem, what you do for them, and how it helps them, right? So be able to articulate that with absolute clarity. Now, product 201, show, don't tell. Often it is very hard, even if you articulate your product clearly. They often say a picture tells 1,000 words, a demo tells 100,000 words. When you actually see a product in action, it is amazing. And we've seen some pitches that are really compelling because they actually dive straight into a demo. They have like maybe 2 minutes of upfront conversation, and then they go into a demo. And really showing the product, and specifically if there's a certain wow factor in that product, a certain delight, then suddenly eyes will lit up and people will be at the edge of their seat and they understand what you're doing. And sometimes you can do that with a demo. If you can't, then you still want to show it with whether it is screenshot or screencast, short videos. There's different ways of doing it. But you want to try and make your product come to life so that people truly get it, which still is often very hard with just words or just a picture. So try and show as much as you can. Then business model. And I think what's interesting is often when people talk about business model, they just show their pricing or they just show their monetization. But the reality is much more than that. So far, we've been speaking about product, and you can build a fantastic product, but it doesn't mean that you have a business, right? So you want to be able to articulate why doing allows you to actually build a business, and hopefully a sustainable business, a large business, or an enduring business, as we often say. So that's not just about building a product and creating value for others, but also delivering that value, getting it to your customers, and then capturing value for your own company. So if you think about create, right, what are the activities you're doing, the assets, your partners, all of that comes together to build the product that we just spoke about. Your delivery is more around your go-to-market, how you communicate with your customers, the channels, etc. And we'll speak about that in a second. And then thirdly, capturing, we'll speak about that when we speak about traction. And can you show that you can actually monetize your product, that there's a willingness to pay, that you can deliver revenue, that your cost structure is such that that revenue is actually more than your cost structure so that you can make a margin as well. Like all of these things are part of business model. And I just mentioned deliver there, right? Go to market. And we skip that one. that's all about distribution. So business model 201 is not just talking about, again, pricing and monetization, but things like go-to-market strategy, right? How are you getting distribution? They often talk about, specifically in the seed stage, what is your path to your first customers? Now, when it's about consumer businesses, they often speak about what are your first 1,000 users, right? And a lot has been written even recently around that. What are the different growth hacks, the channels that you can use? How can you drive organic, etc. For SMEs, often it's a bit harder to get to the first 1,000, but like what are the first 100 that you can get? Or when we work with larger companies, SaaS, seed stage SaaS companies, we often think about what are the first 10 large customers, right? But these are customers that might give you, 50, 80, 100K of annual contract value. So these are larger contracts. You might not get hundreds or thousands of those in the early days. Can you crack the first 10? Because we believe that if you can crack the first 10, you can crack the next 10 and the next 10 and the first 100, etc. Right? So what is your path to the first customers? Beyond that is about your growth strategy, right? You might show that you can acquire customers or land them, but specifically in B2B, there's a strategy of land and expand. So do you have a clear strategy around landing customers and then expanding and growing them, right? And we'll speak more about that later on, what that looks like from a customer retention point of view and things like that. And then thirdly, can you demonstrate that you have a certain unfair advantage in reaching your target customers or in activating unique channels that get you to your customers, right? So being able to show some clarity in your go-to-market strategy and hopefully some smart, unique approach that gives you an unfair advantage is very important. Because I think business model is important. This one actually doesn't have just a 201, but a 301 as well. And that is about moats. This is Warren Buffett, who once said that the most important thing to me is figuring out how big a moat there is around the business. What I love, of course, is a big castle and a big moat with piranhas and crocodiles. In other words, you can build a product now and you can build a business model now, but is it sustainable? Is it differentiated and competitive? Not just now, but in the long run. What are the things that allow you to build these moats around your business? And there's many moats that you can think about, but one is network effects, right? Once you have more and more users, there's more and more value for others. In strong network effects businesses, often those are two-sided models, like marketplaces. Like in India right now, Amazon and Flipkart, both have certain network effects around. More merchants means more products, and so more consumers because there's more choice. More consumers means more merchants want to get on that platform, etc. Network effects. That also ties into switching costs, right? If at some stage a network has a lot of demand, for example, the cost of switching off that platform are really high. But switching costs can also be different if you are building entirely your platform on a certain technology and all your APIs are written to that platform, or your learning has been to that platform, then moving off is very costly. So those are switching costs. Another thing is just distribution and scale. Like if you look at someone like Katabook, for example, that now has, I think 8, 9, 10 million merchants on their platform, that distribution gives such an edge because other people want to be on that platform, and you actually become a distribution platform for others sometimes. It also allows you to build more and more products. So you might penetrate. Again, this is the land and expand. You might land with one product, and sometimes that product might even be free, and that's the way you get distribution. But then you can start offering more products and more services, and often start monetizing on the back of that, right? Cost structure, when you've done stuff uniquely smart and you can do it much better than others, that might give you an unfair advantage. A company like Amazon always prides itself on customer obsession and giving a customer experience, like the one-click checkout, which now more people have. They were the first to do that, and that gave them a big edge over others. But there's also more and more companies that basically have unique access to data or algorithms. Sequoia recently invested, for example, in a company called a seed company called Echo.ai that was set up by a world-renowned cardiologist. And they had a unique set of annotated data about echocardiograms, basically heart films, and had built the AI to automatically be able to interpret and read these, and basically save for each patient, save more than an hour or 2 hours of costly time from cardiologists, of which there's a shortage. So they had massive data, as a moat, but also certain algorithms around it. And then obviously you have brand and design. If you think about Apple, both the brand and design, sometimes these things go hand in hand. You can mention Tesla here as well. So being able, from a business model point of view, to summarize, to move beyond just here's my pricing model, to I truly understand how, instead of just a product, I can turn this into a business, right? In this business, I understand how I create value and an amazing product and a strong value proposition, but also how I take it to market, and then how I defend it by building moats around it. Like, that's the holy grail, right? And being able to talk about that with clarity is hugely impressive often. Let me pause for a second, take a sip of water. Is there any questions so far?
I think, Payal, you want to join us? Gautam, you might need to move Payal back into the stream so she can ask us some questions.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks, Peter. There are a few questions, Peter and Rajan, that I'd like us to address now. Before that, I'm seeing some questions on the stream saying, how can you contact Surge? Just wanted to say you can get any and all information about Surge on our website. That's www.surgeahead.com. Everything from our timelines, process of application, deadlines, everything is available there. On to the questions. The first question is, how much of detail do you get into when you talk about customer personas in the main deck? Like, how many slides do you devote to this? How much do you explain it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I actually like how you phrase the question in terms of in the main deck, right? Because when we're talking about a main deck here, like I once saw a founder pitch, and with every question, he went straight into the appendix. He had all the data. It's almost like if he knew exactly the 30 questions we're going to ask, because for every question he had something in the backup. I think in the main deck, you want to be able to speak about the pain and your understanding of the customer. I've seen, in all honesty, few pitch decks that have multiple slides on user personas, but it's a wonderful thing to have in an appendix. In the main deck, you should talk about the customers. You should demonstrate an understanding of your customers. You can maybe verbalize how you thought about personas. If people dive in and you have it in the backup, it's great. But the main thing is to, again, keep it concise in the main deck, but do demonstrate that you understand your customer. But Rajan, feel free to add, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it's good to have at least 1 or 2 slides, right? So let's say you're building a consumer business. Actually show some, especially whether you've launched or not, right? If you haven't launched, you've done a lot of research. Show some pictures of actual images, right, of the type of consumers. If it's a consumer business, you can say, hey, look, here's, this is a name of a person. Here's this who she is. Here are the the needs that she has, right? And so that it brings it to life, right? And Peter also mentioned this, show pictures. By the way, images are very, very important because it kind of brings to life the user that you're trying to do. So you could, for instance, let's say you're building a consumer business and you have 2 main type of sort of user personas you're going after, right? Show pictures of consumers that represent that sort of that persona you're going to target, right? And at most, maybe a second page would be okay, right? And for instance, you could be going after SMBs, right? And so one could be saying, hey, look, here's sort of an example of the kind of small business that we're going after, and then you can show another page that says, they're slightly different, but they also have different needs. But I wouldn't go more than 1 or 2 pages. But I do think even in the main deck, at least having 1 page where you bring to life the user personas is very important. And then, as Peter said, you can have a few slides in the backup if they want to get into more detail. You can do that, and but try to use images wherever possible, because images are sort of people connect with imagery, right? And talking about real people is always is better than talking about users in abstraction, right? So if you're talking about, let's say, a small business owner in India, talking about putting an image of an actual small business owner who's a customer, or if you haven't launched actually, that you've talked to as you've done your user research, is very, very helpful, because it helps for us as investors it helps bring to life the story that you're trying to tell.
Thanks, Rajan and Peter. The second question is, if you have multiple products, then how do you show your value proposition?
It's a good question. I think the question is, in the early days, is one of focus, and should you have multiple products? Again, when I talked about product architecture and structure, I assume they're not completely different products that are doing completely different things to different customers, because that might be a challenge in the beginning. You always have to think about how are they combined, and at the next level of abstraction, so to speak, what problem are they solving? And so, like, I work very closely with a B2C company that helps merchants in Southeast Asia, and they have a cashback product, but they also have a loyalty product. But the net for both cashback to acquire customers and the other product, they're both helping merchants to attract and retain customers. So two different products with different unit economics. Technology is different. They're sitting in one app, but at the next level, they're achieving one goal and solving one problem for the customer. So it's about how you think about that combination and that product architectural structure that I spoke about. I wouldn't recommend doing completely different products to completely different customer sets. One question that we do get a lot, though, is if you're a two-sided marketplace and you have, for example, merchants, like think about like Airbnb with hosts and guests, or Ola with passengers and drivers, any two-sided model, it only works if you solve a problem for both sides. And that is sometimes harder because you indeed have to think about the problem from both sides, the product for both sides, the value, etc. And you need to be able to articulate that in a succinct way. And that's not always easy. So from that point of view, a very good question.
Hey, just to let me add to that, I think as a seeds, look, eventually all companies to become very large companies, not all, but most will have become multi-product companies, right? Whether they're on the consumer side or on the business side. However, at seed stage, it's very important that you talk about the core product, right? So you have a user persona, you have a set of needs that you're trying to meet, and you're going to build, either you've launched or you're going to launch a product. So at the seed stage, it's fine in a product roadmap to say that, look, we will launch products over a period of time, but focus more on the core product. Because at the seed stage, remember, we are trying to understand exactly who's the user you're targeting, what is the pain point that you have, and what is this product that you've either built or that you're going to build that is going to create incredible consumer love that Peter will talk about. So in the early stages, really focus on, if you have two already that you've launched, focus more on the one that you think is going to scale initially. Obviously, we all know that over a period of time, you're going to add multiple products and so on and so forth. But initially, think about Google, right? Google's original product was search. Today, Google has 7 products that are billion user products. But if you go back to 1998, when Larry and Sergey launched Google, they were focused on one product. It was search. And by the way, they were the 9th search engine, right? They were not the first. It's just that they did search better than others did.
Fabulous. Actually, tons of questions, but I think in the interest of time, we'll take one more and then pause again later. This one says, should there be pre-existing data available, or is the future potential of unique data collection through the product defensible for building a competitive moat?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure I fully grasp it, to be frank. Rajan, maybe, I'm not sure you, but...
Yeah, I think let me try to, I think the question is, Peter, let's say you launch a product and you start gathering a lot of data, and then that data, does it become useful and become a competitive moat over a period of time? I think I'll take a crack at it. I think, Peter, that's sort of what it is. Peter, I'll take a crack at it, then you should build on it. Look, it depends, right? So Peter talked about network effects being a very powerful moat. Now, keep in mind, very few businesses have network effects. What that means is every user or every supplier, buy side or sell side that you add, creates sort of, incremental moat. So think about a social network, right? Every person that comes will bring other people. So every person that you add actually is more than just one ad, right? It brings their entire network as well. So if it's a network effects business, and please keep in mind, a lot of founders talk about network effects. Actually, very few businesses have network effects. So if you're going to talk about a business that had network effects, first thing you should do, make absolutely sure that you are in the kind of business that has network effects. And again, I say, Very few businesses have network effects. But in a business that has network effects, for instance, data can become very, very powerful, right? There are other kinds of businesses. For instance, if you're collecting lots of data in a business, let's say you're in a healthcare business where you're leveraging AI, right? The more data you have, the better your machine models get, and the better your algorithms get, and so on and so forth. So I think it depends a lot on the kind of business that you're in and how powerful data becomes. And in those kinds of businesses, yes, absolutely, data, and over time, having data makes your algorithms better, and therefore that becomes a competitive moat. The one thing you should keep in mind is your investors, especially the investors that you're going to pitch in that are most likely to going to invest in your company, they will be very, very deep. They'll be very knowledgeable about those kinds of businesses, right? So be very thoughtful when you talk about moats. And by the way, I remember, over the last couple of search cohorts, we have invested in founders who came and said, you know what, we don't have a moat yet. The reality is that a seed stage founder, you don't have a moat, but they had some good thoughts on what could become moats. And we said, that's, first of all, it's very encouraging that they actually said, look, we don't have any moats yet because we're a seed stage company, right? And they also said, look, we don't know what the moat is going to be, but here are some possibilities of what a moat could be. So Peter, I don't know whether you want to add to that.
No, listen, I agree. And what I like in your example just there is the vulnerability and honesty that the founder was sharing there in terms of we don't have any moats yet. The fact that they're talking about it is a good sign. I've personally have experienced investing in a company that had an amazing viral hook and was gathering lots of data. And the data that they were gathering was a key reason to invest and holds a lot of potential. But in that and other investments, I've also learned that sometimes it's actually really hard to then leverage that data in the right way and monetize that. So if your DNA is we're amazing with organic customer acquisition and we can acquire a lot of customers and gather data in the process, but our tech, our marketing might be really good, but our tech might not be that good. Our data and algorithms isn't there as a moat. Then it's not always easy to actually do something useful with that data. So you have to be able to show that you can acquire it, but also that you know what you're going to do with it and how. Yeah, that will be just my short answer.
Okay, let's move on. I'll ask the rest of the questions later.
Okay, sounds good. Let's move on and maybe quickly take stock, right? I showed this earlier, the anatomy of the pitch deck, and obviously so far we've talked about the why. And we talked about the storytelling, understanding your customers deeply, the personas, etc., and your product, being able to articulate that, and also your business model, go-to-market modes, etc. But ultimately, an investor wants to know how you're doing, right? Is there any traction, right? And so that's the next piece that we're going into. Like, how are you actually doing? Like, where are you, right? And so traction. A lot of people ask us, like, would Search invest if we don't have any revenue yet, right? The reality is there's companies that have IPO'd on the NASDAQ with no revenue, right? And so it would be unfair for Search or any seed investor to say, we need to see revenue. But traction can be looked at in many different ways, right? And so one really important one, like revenue is often a lagging indicator, right? Not a leading indicator. You get revenue because you do other things well. The other things often start with building an amazing product that people love, right? So a main thing around traction, and again, we focused a lot on the customer in even the previous part of this discussion and the personas. Now you get to what traction means, that those customers actually love what you're doing, right? That that the product usage shows strong retention, that there's passionate user feedback, and we show some examples of that. It could also be growth in other ways, right? The number of customers going up, the usage overall going up, or usage per customer, or time spent per day on your app is going up, or frequency of transactions is going up, etc. So revenue is here, but it's not the only one. And many companies don't have revenue when they raise their seed round, right? Another thing is monetization. Again, some people won't have it, and often they don't have it by design in the early days. But thinking about willingness to pay, Rajan in the introduction mentioned that earlier this week we had a whole session on pricing and monetization, and one of the, let's say, the teachers there took an interesting approach where he said many people talk about, like, are you building a product that people want? But he changed it into, are you building a product that people are willing to pay for, And that's a whole different thing, right? Because it's one thing that people want a product, but if it's free, there's a lot of things I want, right? But what am I really willing to pay for? And is my need for that product higher? And that then ties also into your unit economics. So these are all signs of traction. You can't have all of these, to be frank, but you should have one or two of them so that there is something that an investor can hang their hats on and like, hey, something is working. Like there might not be monetization yet. Growth is maybe early, but the customer love is amazing. Or hey, customer love, there's been some bugs in our app and our star rating on the App Store isn't phenomenal yet, but look at how transactions are growing or customers are growing. Like you want something that is spiking to show that things are working well. So, as expected, a key thing that we look for in traction is engagement and customer love. And engagement is a sign of customer love. And this is an example, a graph from a pitch deck. You look at this in one go, like, hey, there's more app users. The percentage MAU is going up, weekly average users, daily average users. And this is on the engagement side. This is not engagement, but just the growth in number of customers that I mentioned, right? Just in 1 month, like many, many more merchants. This was obviously very much in the early days of the company. Then, traction 201 is show customer love. And this is an app that is a D2C brand that is doing invisible aligners and more products that help you get a better smile. They call it Smile Cosmetics. But as you can see here, they talk about how often the app gets opened, like every 5 days, which for a product like this is actually a lot. How much people are uploading, so that's a sign of engagement. Recommendation, star ratings on the app, service level of clinics. What is interesting is very often we have seed founders that basically say, hey, we're very early, we don't have data. The reality is that's rarely the case. Even when you're 3 months, there's a lot of things you can measure. And we really value it when we see a certain level of data orientation in customers. And again, that is not just financial data and P&L, etc., which is very useful, but it's not the only thing. It could be things like this, right? This is not financial, but it gives you numbers. And here's another example of BoboBox, which is an Indonesian company that was part of Search One. Look at the number of data points here. None of it is financial, but it shows customer love, like Net Promoter Score, highest app rating in the industry. They looked at different platforms that sell their services and the reviews there on Ticket, which is the one of the largest travel companies in Indonesia alongside Traveloka. So they looked at all these different platforms. And when you see a slide like this, right, even though revenue might not be super strong yet, or, certain things might not be there, you look at this and you're like, wow, people love it, right? The experience is truly unique. It's truly different. Like across the board, across all these different metrics and platforms, people love it, right? So that's very, very powerful. And one of the key things why customer love is so important is because retention is king, as we often say. And we often go into detailed cohort analysis, which is maybe too much to discuss in detail. But here on the left, you see the retention over time for different cohorts of users. And very often there's a steep drop off, and then it flattens out, the gray line, which is kind of like acceptable depending on what level it flattens out at. The not so good one is the thing that keeps declining and keeps declining and never flattens out, because it basically means that you continue to lose users. The one that you want, and here it's only slightly smiling, but we've seen much stronger ones where there's people that drop off, but over time they all come back and they start using the service, right? And hopefully at the higher level of retention. So retention is super important. If you look at that again at the cohort level, what that means, and this is an example from SaaS companies. On the right, you see different cohorts where customers that came in month 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Every cohort continues to grow, right? And so think about that as revenue. I might have some customers, my number of customers might go down a bit, but if the customers that stay in a cohort start spending more, you actually have revenue expansion on a cohort level. And you see there two things. You see growth accelerate, not flatten out on the right, at least my right. But you also see, they actually start reaching levels of, in this case, 450 million. Whereas the other one is growth is declining, but it also flattens out as a result, in this case at 140 million. And so it is super important from a customer love point of view, but ultimately from a revenue point of view. Another way to look at that, by the way, guys, is that all these customers that have come on, you've paid for them most likely. There's been customer acquisition cost. So your CAC to LTV, your ratio of lifetime value to customer acquisition cost, becomes really challenged if the lifetime value goes down because lifetime goes down because there's no retention, right? So retention leads to a longer lifetime, leads to longer lifetime value, and a higher ratio of your lifetime value of a customer compared to what you've paid to acquire that customer, which is a thing that many investors will look at. The last thing, again, for traction, we have a 301 here is unit economics. And again, that only works for companies that are already monetizing, but understanding your unit price or your price per transaction or per order, understanding your cost of goods sold and your gross margin, like are you paying, again, the exact way of doing unit economics depends for a business, and it looks different for a D2C brand versus a marketplace versus a SaaS company, etc. But being able to understand what your unit of value is, what your cost of goods sold are, and hence your gross margin, then how much are you spending on customer acquisition cost, CAC, what you see here. And then the one that they call PC3 here, which is a bit of a technical term, it basically is your contribution margin after marketing cost. That is a really important thing that people look at. So if you don't have them yet because there's no revenue, etc., then don't talk about it. But if you have it, flaunt it, because it shows that you look at your business not just as a product, but as a business, and where you understand the financials and where you understand that it's not just about GMV or transactions or whatever, and not just about revenue, but like, can I actually make a margin, either a gross margin or a contribution margin on each unit of value that I sell. Next is future. So what I mentioned earlier is, right, you've now shown why you're building what you're building in terms of product and business model, and you show that it's working, right? Customers love it, they're staying, they're buying more, they're growing, etc. Once you've shown that, an investor will say, that's wonderful, now what? Where do you go from here? What is that larger vision, right? What is the upside that an investor can gain? But for you, it basically means, like, can you show a compelling vision, right? And if all goes well, what have you built in 5 years? And one of my partners in Sequoia, Mohit, he has a trick. He actually has an investor. He writes an email to a founder as if it's 5 years from now. But you can even do that for yourself. Write an email to your future self now that celebrates the fabulous success that you will have achieved in 5 years. It's really interesting, and it's a mind exercise. We often call it just like you have a post-mortem that you do after death. Here we call it a pre-parade, which you write before success, not before failure, right? And so you write that, and it really helps you to articulate that vision, not just how you define success, but how you've become successful, right? So being able to articulate that is quite impressive. And it's hard to do that in words. Future, 201 is paint a picture. And, in the case of Kata Book, they describe that as, how they start with certain software that is geared towards drive engagement. We just had a conversation about data, by the way. So this is about, like, you now gather data on lending, on payments, on deposits, etc. And ultimately, there's a monetization plan. I think this is one of the best examples of describing, it's not a technical product roadmap, but it's a broader vision in terms of what something can become. And even though, on day one, it might be only one feature, again, it also comes back to the previous question around, one product or multiple products. You might start with one and you penetrate a market, but then there's an expansion across multiple products, and in this case, different levels and layers of service. It's quite compelling. Right. Then market. I'm not sure how many of the people that are listening to this know who Don Valentine is, but he's actually the founder of Sequoia. He founded Sequoia in 1972. And he's very well known to be a strong believer in the power of markets. he said many things about that. One being that we've always focused on the market, the size of the market, the dynamics of the market, the nature of the competition. Great markets make great companies. If you don't attack a big market, it's very highly unlikely that you're ever going to build a big company, right? So, by the way, this is also why some folks prefer to have market and discuss market much more in the beginning. In the way we've structured this flow, we talk in a high-level fashion about it when we talk about what has changed in the market, what has changed for our customers. But when you talk about your future vision, you might have an amazing vision, but if you have an amazing vision and no market in which to execute, you have a problem. So you need to show that there is upside by having an amazing vision in an amazing market, a market that has a high target addressable market, but within that has the right level of revenue potential. And if it hasn't got that, that shows the right adjacent markets that you can go into, right? It's one thing to have a market that is large, but is it static? Is it growing? And showing market size as well as growth is important. And ideally, back to the problem slide that we saw earlier, where we talked about fragmentation, you want to show that there's market inefficiencies, right? What is the complexity? What is the fragmentation? What are the user needs that are not being served? And so, again, many folks in terms of market talk just about market size. What Don Valentine here says already is the dynamics of the market. In other words, the industry structure. What are the different layers in there? What are the players? What are the revenue pools, the margin structure? Like being able to demonstrate a certain level of understanding of this is very important. Another way to look at that is not just top down, which is what many people do. They look just at, oh yeah, it's a $10 billion market. We only need 10% and we're there. Sometimes it's much more, it's much better to do bottom up, because basically investors will try to understand the level of skill, or you need to understand the level of skill that excites investors in your business. So think bottom up. Can this be $1 billion business, which often equates to like, can you deliver 100 million of revenue? And so there's different paths to that, right? And there's some famous articles being written about that, but that basically say, hey, I can either do 10 million customers that give me $10 every month, or 1 million customers that give me $100, all the way up to the elephants, where every customer, this is more like enterprise B2B, give me $100,000 of revenue, and I only need 1,000 customers, right? So essentially, the smaller end of the spectrum here is more B2C. The so-called rabbits and deers are the customers that pay about $1,000 a year, 10,000. It's kind of like mid-market SME. And then the large enterprise is the elephants, right? And so being able to think about that, and what are your drivers? So we recently saw a company that talked about that and said like, hey, we now have X number of customers and they pay us X number of dollars a year. In 2025, we think that we can get there. And they talk about the uplift, right? And so then the key growth levers is basically your growth plan that needs to be able to demonstrate to us that, hey, that's believable. Like, can they make us believe as an investor that they can get from $3,000 to $10,000 per customer, and from 500 customers to 10,000, right? And so that is a more bottom-up path that, again, sometimes you get really detailed models with lots of assumptions. That's really tough. Top-down is okay, and this is kind of like back on the envelope, but sometimes doing that in a simple yet compelling way with clarity is much more powerful than overly complex 3 to 5 year plans with lots of assumptions that are hard to follow and hard to believe. We're almost getting to the end of this section, and then the next one is quite fast. You do want to understand your competition and alternatives, right? We just talked about market and market structure. What are the players in that market? Not just direct, but also indirect. I once spoke to a senior leader in Unilever, and he was speaking about usage among kids. And when they had a bit of money, they used to buy ice cream that was Unilever, but now they were buying prepaid cards on Barty. Are they natural competitors? No, but indirectly, they're sometimes vying for the same, pocket money in this case with kids, or the same budget in an enterprise. And so sometimes there's indirect alternatives like that, or like just not doing anything, right? And so thinking about these alternatives, thinking about not just how you're better, but how you're different, and how you plan to win. And like one of the things that Jeff Bezos always said, and as mentioned, I used to work for Amazon, is it's okay to understand your customer, but you have to obsess over your customer. So although this is important, you've seen the relative time that we give to this versus understanding your customer and obsessing over your customer is right what you should have as well. But you still should understand your competitor. Hey, and then lastly, on this section, team. Obviously, like every person will look for A+ founders, as they call it, but they will also look for product founder fit, right? Has this founder got a unique understanding of this market? Has he or she got a deep understanding of the problems, experience in how to address that, and maybe some unique insight that other people haven't had? When there's co-founders, you also want to understand whether there's some sort of joint, like did they just meet each other like 3 weeks ago, or have they worked together, and is there a sign of or demonstration of joint success? And then lastly, it's not just about the founders, but it's also about a strong second level. So here's an example of a team slide that we've seen, and again, this company in this slide was from a bit later than seed stage, so you're not expected to have like these types of rock stars from day one. Think about the slides more as a how should I structure that slide, because it talks about what they've learned and what they've done. It talks about their unique skills that they've gained, as well as some of their experience. So the structure of not just having a name or a logo, but like being able to articulate why their skills are unique and uniquely valuable for what you're doing, that's quite important. So with that, we've covered all the parts of the anatomy of the pitch deck. Let me quickly pause and see if there's questions before we go to the next part. Or Prayal, do you prefer to finish up and leave all the questions to the end?
No, I think a few questions, Peter, that will be good to take.
Okay.
So let's just address 2 or 3 of these now. There's one which says that if a startup doesn't have MVP yet, how do you measure traction?
So not MVP as in no product at all?
Yes.
Yeah, I think then it's indeed tougher. And actually, what I had on a previous slide was sometimes even it said something like even research can work, but you want to like the reality is the less product or traction there is to go by, the more that you have to tell an amazingly compelling story about you as a founder and the market that you're going after, and your understanding of the problem, because the product isn't there yet. You can't talk about that, but then. Like, how strong are you as a founder? How strong is that product founder fit in terms of what you're building and in the market? Because again, there is no product, there is no traction. It's very hard to go by. So founder, market, and thesis about the product and understanding of the problem are the main things that you would go by then. But Rajan, feel free to add, please.
Yeah, no, I just build on that. So keep in mind, if the second cohort of search, I'm just using search only as an example, right? As we talked about last time, by the way, those that weren't here last time, please do spend the time to watch the webinar from last time, because that talked about all the different funding sources you can go to, depending on how much you want to raise and so on. But in our last cohort, second cohort of search, we had 20 companies, 6 of them were pre-launch, right? And in pre-launch companies, clearly there's no traction data. So what investors will look for is the quality of the founding team, product founder fit, or you can call it founder market fit, which Peter talked about here, is why does this founding team have a unique right to win in this market, right? And do they have all the other things that we look for, right? The right complementary expertise, signs of perseverance, right? Because it takes 10, 15 years to build a company and so on. So that's sort of one part. The second is the market, right? We would look for your understanding of the problem of the market and the problem that you're going to solve to be very, very deep. That's where, making sure that you have extensive research into the market, right? And specifically around what's the real pain point that you're going to go after? And then also you're thinking on what is the product you're going to build, right? And why is that product really going to be so much better at solving the customer's pain point, right? So you don't need traction. Obviously, if you haven't launched it, you're not going to have any traction. But keep in mind that you're going to have very, very deep and unique insights into the market that you're trying to solve. So focus on sort of the founder market or the founder product fit, and also the market that you're going to try. So for instance, you'll need a lot more in your main deck on user personas, right? So because we're trying to really understand Do you really understand the type of user that you're going after, and what is the specific pain points that you're trying to solve? And then also on the product, what is the current thinking of the product? It needs to be very deep, right? So you don't need to have traction, but you need to really over-index that in your pitch deck on the other things, because you won't have the data on the traction.
Great. There's another question which says, if there's another player who's catering to an adjacent market and has large distribution, how should you look at building a moat here?
Rajan, you want to start off with that one? It's a great question.
Yeah. So look, I mean, remember, there'll be lots of players. One thing, when you get a question on competition, one thing you shouldn't say is there's no competition. There is no such thing as there's no competition. Okay. There's always a substitute that your consumer is using, or competitors who are in adjacent markets who could get in, right? So look, at the end of the day, as a seed stage startup, focus more on the user, right, that you're going to target, and the pain points of that user, and how you're going to solve the pain points of those users, right? And focus much more on that, as opposed to what is somebody doing in an adjacent market, or what's an existing competitor doing in a different user segment, etc. Because at the end of the day, what is going to make you successful is if you can build a product that your customers are going to love, right? And by the way, that is the most important thing as a seed stage. If you ask me, of all the things we've talked about, what is the most important thing? And especially if you've launched a product, right? Let's say you've launched a product, we are going to look for early signs of customer love, and either you're going to have it or you're not. And maybe at the end we can talk more about that, and less about, look, what's a competitor doing in an adjacent market. Yes, I mean, we will worry that if there's a player in an adjacent market, will they come into this market and take it or not? And that's where we're at a seed stage. We're really making a bet on you as a founding team, right? And your deep insight into this problem you're going to solve, and whether you are going to be able to build a product that is materially different than anything else that can be built. So that's really the bet that we're going to be making. So focus more on the user love that you're going to be able to create through this magical product that you're going to build.
Yeah, maybe let me give you two examples, because I would summarize that in, like, you have to display a unique insight into what you're building and how you're different. And let me give you one example or two. If you think about Stripe, right, and Sequoia is an investor in Stripe. When they started their business, many folks felt that online payments was solved already. Like PayPal was there, and Braintree was there, and there were a ton of others, and they all had distribution. They had many customers. They had reached scale and product market fit already. And then these two Irish brothers come and basically say, hey, listen, we think the world has changed. We think that back in the day, finance was all, or payment gateways was all around finance. And it was the CFO that was deciding on a payment gateway. And it was the CFO that needed to pick and choose the payment gateway. But guess what? The world has changed. Right now, it's the developers. The developers build payment gateways. And so our unique insight is that we're going to build a payment gateway by developers for developers, where all the complexity and the horrible banking integration and whatnot of payment gateways is completely hidden away behind a set of simple APIs. That's what we're going to do. Sequoia and many others have bought into that and backed them, and they've become really successful so far. Earlier on, Rajan mentioned Insider, which is a SaaS company that I actively work with. And initially when they spoke, and sometimes it's also an evolving insight, right? They talked a lot about conversion and engagement and customer acquisition, etc. But when they started looking more deeply and spoke with their customers, they looked at customers that said, hey, we think about the marketing funnel from acquisition to activation, retention, revenue, referral. And we actually are using some of your products in each of these layers. And actually you're helping us to grow. And so they started positioning themselves as a growth management platform where they help primarily brands and marketplaces, etc., to drive growth digitally across the entire growth funnel. And so basically taking a step back from talking about the features, but taking a unique insight to an all-in-one platform and labeling it that, those are the type of unique insights that sometimes help you to position that difference.
Should we take one more and then move on to the next section?
Yeah, sure. Good
okay. How do you showcase your unit economics if you have multiple products? A few of them which are going to be developed and monetized at a later time. Should it be a one-on-one mapping for each product or at an organizational level?
I can give one example from a company, and I actually gave that the same company that I had in mind earlier. They have two products, and they always show blended unit economics, and they show them broken down. And then for both of them, they show them now and 12 months ago and 12 months forward, right? And so you get a really deep understanding of like, hey, what has happened with the unit economics for the individual products, and what are they expecting, and why do they think certain things will improve or not improve? But you also see them at a blended level. So you want to be able to articulate it in a simple manner in your pitch deck. But again, this is something where you might have your blended current and future in your main deck. But if people say, but hey, like you have different products, how is it broken up? If you have an appendix where you go in more detail and where you can split it out. But being able to have the understanding of the underlying drivers for the different products would be useful.
Rajan,
Okay.
do you want to add anything?
No, let's keep going. I think let's get into this next section. I think it's very important.
Cool. All right. This is a much shorter session. Some very simple pitch do's and don'ts, but still good to mention. It might sound obvious, but like, don't lose your audience. Remember the first time I spoke about the title, some people, they get going and it's really hard to understand what they're doing, and you lose your audience. The investors might, get confused or might lose interest. So how can you hook them early on, right? And so there's two ways, right? One is hook them with a story, or specifically when you have a few more slides, you want to hook them with almost like a money slide, which is one powerful slide that summarizes a lot. And so the hooking with a story is very much around telling that story, which comes back to that change, right? And so Zuora is known as a SaaS company from the US to talk about, again, this bigger thing. We now live in this new type of economy, the subscription economy. We've gone through these different changes, and they basically weave a whole narrative in a few slides that that answers the why now, that answers the change, that answers the customer pain, and it ultimately brings you to like, wow, like there's only one thing that I need, and that's Zuora. And they only start talking about themselves in some of these decks, after 5-6 slides. But by that time, you're already so bought in, because they tell a really compelling story. They sell the problem really well, and you really start liking it. So that's one approach. That is hooking with a story. The other, sometimes simpler thing is hook with one slide that immediately is like, oh wow, right? And so here is Zenim is a D2C company that's doing the Smile Cosmetics that I mentioned earlier. Even that term is new, and they have a whole story and a narrative around it. So they actually can tell that story. But in one slide, you're seeing, hey, this company is building a new category. There is a large market, right? They've actually got 7 markets already in 18 months. It shows some really rapid growth in terms of gross margin, and where obviously margin is expanding much faster than that marketing or marketing cost as a percentage of revenue, is going down. Engagement, et cetera, right? And so a lot of these things are actually really strong. And in one go, people will get interested. So that's a way to hook. The other thing is be articulate. Like we often see a lot of slides. We see a lot of words on slides. We see founders wanting to be really smart. But it's actually much more important to be articulate and to drive clarity. First, like not everything that you have to say should be on the slide, right? And maybe start with the bottom here. There's Guy Kawasaki, who's a somewhat famous author and an investor as well. He talks about the 10-20-30 rule. He basically says you should have only 10 slides, talk about it for 20 minutes, and have no font size smaller than 30. And again, the 10 could be 10, 15, 20. It's okay to talk more than 20 minutes, but 30 or 45 or whatever. But the font size not smaller than 30 is actually interesting, because if you do that, you automatically cannot have a lot of words on it. So automatically you become very visual. And so visualizing a lot, which is what you see in some of the examples, and minimizing the number of words and talking with absolute clarity is important. The other thing is what some folks talk about, the 5 seconds rule. I show a slide and I take it away after 5 seconds. Do people get the message, right? And so, for example, I can have a title on a slide that says market size, but then I need to go into the details. If the title says we are going after a $20 billion market, the rest of the slide is the same content. I read that immediately. I'm like, oh, wow, this is a big market, right? And so try already in your title to give value, to give information, and not just say product, but a fully launched product with strong customer love as a title when you talk about product. So these things help to immediately drive a certain message home that you can then support with the right visuals and with clarity of articulation, right? Next is maybe a bit more confusing one, but like there's often people say that investors invest in dots, in lines, not dots, and they often talk about that. For example, if you meet a founder once, like you have one intersection with that founder, you have one times the story. But if you've known someone for some time, you actually start understanding better how a founder is executing, how he's articulating, how he's on a journey. But it also ties into how you present data, for example. So, we have founders or pitch decks that say like, hey, we had 1.4 million of revenue in the last 3 years, or we did X number of transactions, and it's all cumulative. But that doesn't give people a sense of trajectory and trends, right? So you want to avoid any cumulative or aggregate numbers when you present them. You don't want to just have that snapshot in time, but wherever possible, show your trajectory, show the trend, and enable the investor to understand your journey. And frankly, that is good when it's up. But even if it's a bit more volatile, it also gives you an opportunity to have a very honest conversation about what has worked and what hasn't worked. And that actually is a segue to the next one. We often see founders that sell really hard, but what we actually like is founders that are very authentic and very real. Don't make things up. Say it like it is, and show some sense of vulnerability. I once was actually in Bangalore, but one of our senior US partners was there, and there was a founder pitching, and he was just pitching so hard, and he just kept going and going. And then my US colleague only asked one thing in the end, and it was a very profound question. He says, "What do you not know about your business?" And then there was silence. And the founder was in such a pitch mode, and he couldn't answer that question. And he actually fell through in a way because he didn't have the vulnerability to actually say, hey, you know what, this is all working, but this I don't know, or we haven't figured it out yet, or this is where we screwed up, it didn't work. And within Sequoia, at least, there is a very strong culture of get real. And as investors, we constantly have to drink the Kool-Aid and be the biggest fans of the startups that we invest in, but also be real about what's not working and talk about how to address that. So get real. And then last, don't say too much. Be discreet. When you think about your fundraise, ask only the dollars that you raise. Don't give a valuation guidance. We recently had some situation with many people pinged us saying like, hey, we heard you're investing in this company, Sequoia. And we'd met the company once. And it actually had a negative impact on the relationship with that company because, investors normally treat who they speak with a lot of discretion and won't talk about it to others. And they expect that from other founders as well. So it's, we understand why it's happening, but try and, don't tell too much. Don't give your investors even valuation guidance. Let the market price it. Only ask for how much dollars you're raising, and just be discreet in the process overall. I think with that, I've come to the end of what I had wanted to present. Bayal, please advise. There's 2 more slides from a wrapping up point of view. Do we want to do those first, or do we first want to do questions?
Why don't we take questions first,
yes.
right, Bayal?
Yes.
Okay.
Some questions, and then we can wrap. Okay, so the next one, and some of these are pertaining to your older slides, Peter, because we've been kind of keeping them. It says, is it fair to say that showcasing moats can be a hypothesis at a seed stage, as it could have the challenge of being heavily influenced by early adopters, which is crossing the chasm challenge?
Rajan?
Yeah, look, I think look at if you haven't launched yet, all you can have is hypotheses, right? So I think it's fine to say, you should just say, look, we haven't launched yet, so we don't know what our moats are going to be, but we think, it could be X or Y, right? And that's a perfectly good answer. Just give it some thought. I think be ready to, even if you haven't launched yet, you will probably get a question, especially if it's a seasoned investor or investing firm, you will get a question around moats. If not, the investor is thinking to themselves, what moats could this business have? So think through it and have a hypothesis, but they don't expect you to have huge, like a long answer to that, right? Because you haven't launched yet. But think through it. I mean, the things that we've covered today, everyone, are the things that investors either expect to see in the deck, or if they don't see it in the deck, they're asking themselves the question. And if they really like what you're saying, they will ask you the question too. So these are the, Peter's tried to call out the most important things that you should have in your pitch deck. But again, keep in mind, if you haven't launched, you won't have a bunch of these, right? So, which is fine. But if you haven't launched, make sure you over-index on the other things that we've talked about, like the market size, the specific customer personas, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a question saying, if you're building a product using technology which our investors are not really familiar with, how do we go about pitching such a category?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I recently led an investment for Sequoia in a quantum computing company. And I've quickly learned what I think is a lot, but basically is less than 0.1% that there is to learn in a space like that. And so you'll often have that situation. And again, when I spoke earlier on product and on being able to explain features and values, you won't always be able to explain the depth of the technology, but explain, again, your understanding of the customers, how this technology is helping solve their problems. And what we didn't talk about today, but what sometimes happens is sometimes people talk about, here's our product, and then they have a slide that says, what's the underlying magic? So that's the differentiation. That is where you can actually talk about that technology. And the reality is, investors invest in a lot of different technologies, in a lot of different sectors. They won't always be able to understand and appreciate in depth what the underlying magic is and what it is that you've built. And so it's up to you to some extent to explain that. And sometimes I can understand, like, whatever, 20, 30% of the depth of that technology, but you're able to impress because of your deep understanding, because of the nuance, because of certain, references or credibility that you can get, that you can share on that technology. But the burden is on the founder and on the company to be able to translate that into a strong story in terms of product and value proposition.
Yeah, what I would add to that is, we meet a lot of deep tech startups who focus on the tech and not on the problem that you're trying to solve, right? As investors, I mean, speaking for myself, and Peter can speak for myself, right? What I really want to know is, who is the customer and what is the problem that you're trying to solve, right? So for instance, actually last week, I talked to an ag tech startup that was using sort of one of the next generation technologies, but the entire discussion focused on who is the user, which part of the ag value chain are they focused on, and what is the big problem that they were trying to solve, right? And then they got to look, we're going to solve it with a certain kind of technology, which sort of makes sense. It's actually a really good use case, right? So I think what especially I find with deep tech startups is they spend so much time focusing on building tech and really deep tech, without focusing as much on, are they solving a real problem? Who are they solving it for? What is the problem that they're solving it for? And is that problem large enough for this to become a big company, right? Because keep in mind, as investors, we're trying to figure out, is this going to become a really large company? And at Sequoia, at Surge, we're actually going even beyond, saying, is this going to become a legendary company, right? That is going to really have an impact on the country, the industry, and in some cases, the world at large. So always, one thing that will always serve you well is to keep coming back to, who is the customer and what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And is this problem large enough so that it can lend itself to a large company? And I realize in deep tech, that is something you get to, but keep in mind, that's what we're asking too.
Peter, question directed at you. Traditional business model guides state that it is imperative to have an exit strategy. However, your deck does not mention that. Is it something necessary to include?
Good question. In all reality, different investors take a different view here. Sequoia in general is very much a long-term investor. And although in the long run, exit is very important, specifically in seed stage, frankly, you have no clue what's going to happen yet, right? There's so much permutation still possible. There's so much paths. Like many companies, we invest in seed and within 6 months or within 2 years, it's become a different business. It's very hard to talk exit early on. And so the mantra that I've often heard specifically for seed and early stages: just focus on building value. When you build value, then value will come. And once you're 5-7 years into your journey, you start getting more clarity on what an exit strategy is. In some companies, it's really clear straight up. But at least for me personally, when I start looking at a seed stage investment, I do look at all the things we spoke about. I do look at the market size, and can this become really big? But if it becomes really big, it will have value to someone from an acquisition point of view, or might even evolve to be a long-term standalone company that might IPO. But at the seed stage, actually sometimes it even works. Like if a founder in the early days, this early, shows that they're focused on an exit, then I might ask myself, is this founder building for the long run or not? And is it too transactional? Again, different investors have a different approach there, but for me, it's not something that is very important in the early days.
Rajan, do you want to add something?
No, I agree with that. Look, I mean, you may get that question from investors, but at seed stage, look, it's not a very relevant question. Look, as investors, what we should be caring about, and what, for instance, at Sequoia and Surge we care about, is we want to partner with the absolute best founders who we think are going to build legendary companies, right? And as Peter said, look, if you build an extremely important and valuable company, I mean, exit options are going to be plenty, right? You could take it public. Lots of companies may want to buy it, and so on. So it is a question that some seed stage investors ask. So you should give it a little bit of thought, but you don't need to. You certainly shouldn't put that in a pitch deck. To Peter's point, having a slide that says, exit options, because the investor first question is asking, oh my God, they're already thinking about exit. They barely launched this company and now they want to sell it. That's a red flag. So don't put it in your deck. But if the question comes up, you should be ready to answer it.
Great. Next question is, if a startup is at the ideation stage and has USPs that are currently not offered by competitors, is it a good time to approach investors? Because if we build a prototype and do a one-city test launch, it increases the possibility of competitors replicating these USPs and impacting our first-to-market advantage.
So, interesting question, but I would answer... or my answer will be around business model moats. Like you can't not launch because people will see your product. Like in the end, or not in the end, in the beginning, like it all starts when you go to market and when people start seeing. And if the USPs are so easily to replicate, then they're not USPs, right? They're not unique selling points. They're selling points. And so unique means that they're unique, but they should also be uniquely defensible, and you should have some moat. So ultimately, like there will be competition, and specifically with models that are working very well. Uber, Airbnb, things like Pinduoduo in China, Meesho in India. Like people see a certain model, and many clones start coming up very quickly. And you have to make sure that you're the best and that you're ahead, and that your understanding of the problem is deeper than others. So I wouldn't fear going to market. Again, if it's pre-launch, we talked about raising pre-launch earlier, and so we gave some answers around what you should focus on if it's pre-launch. But I wouldn't keep it pre-launch for the reasons that were implied by the question. Ultimately, you need to go to market. People will see it, and you have to be able to defend it and be sustainable in your USP.
Yeah, I agree with that, and also keep in mind that fundraising is not the objective, right? The objective is to build an enduring company that you're going to be proud of, that's going to make an impact on the world. So, and I would say that, and by the way, those of you that haven't watched our first series from last week, please do watch it, because it's very, very important. But I would say, look, if you've got the ability to launch, because remember, until you launch, you're not going to really know what your users think about the product, right? So, I spent a long time at Google, and Google's sort of one big core principle was launch and iterate, right? Especially if it's the kind of product, if it's an app or a consumer product that you can launch and learn from the market. Because once you launch in the market is when you actually start learning. So if you've got a co-founding team, let's say 2 or 3 of you, where collectively you can actually build the product, launch it, and then start getting feedback, because very quickly you'll start learning about what works and what doesn't work. So I completely agree with Peter. I don't think you should worry about if you launch, everybody else is going to find out, because let's face it, right? Whether it's now or 3 months from now, they're going to find out anyway. And the big question is, can you build something that users are going to love, that consumers are going to love, or business customers are going to love, right? That is the question that you want to try to answer as a seed stage company.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question, and I think we can go on to the last bit, which is for technology products, how does patent affect pitching, and at what stage of patenting is it a good time to pitch for funding?
Rajan, you want to take that first?
Yeah, look, I think in terms of patents, right? If it's the kind of business where patents are going to really protect you, right? You can patent it early. I mean, and you should, right? But I find that a lot of startups think that their ideas or their approaches or your methodologies or technologies are patentable, but they're really not. So I would say if it is something where IP really does matter, if it's an IP-driven business, which there are quite a few, and you think it's different, and that is the core differentiated thing that you're going to build, then certainly patent it early, right? And don't wait.
Yeah.
Okay.
So hey, there was one question that I saw on Twitter from Startup Sanatana, asking about personas as well. And specifically whether you consider other factors like country, culture, personal taste, etc. I think the short answer there is yes, you consider those as well. You're trying to understand the different types of users, and that could include the cultural differences where they are, and what that means for how they use a product. Like I can only imagine if you think about Airbnb that there are so much cultural differences between users from China versus from India versus from the US versus from many places around the world. And you have to start thinking about what do they think of a holiday? What do they think about a house, or how do they live or sleep or whatever? And so these things in terms of cross-cultural definitely comes into account. And you can do that later on when you say, hey, I first go for a certain core user in one market and then I localize. But some businesses are global from day one, and you should consider those. So wanted to make sure I answered that question as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. I think Rajan and Peter, we actually have 2-3 questions just on Surge itself. So do you want to just wrap and take those questions at the same time?
Yeah, sure.
Why don't we? Let's do that. So let's go to the next slide, Payal. I think, well, first of all, guys, thank you so much for joining us. Those of you that had the questions on Surge, you're welcome to stay behind. And we want to be respectful of your time. We're already 12 minutes behind. So thank you for staying with us. We've had a large number of you on our various live stream channels with us. So thank you for joining. And hopefully you found the second of our 4-part series useful. As I said, this is a 4-part series. This is number 2. Next Saturday, 4 p.m. So same time, same Saturday at 4 p.m. India time. So 6:30 Singapore time, etc. We'll have our 3rd part. And we have 2 more investors who will join me. Shanti Mohan, who's the founder and CEO of Let's Venture. Let's Venture is the largest crowdfunding platform in India. If you're in India, I'm sure and you're an entrepreneur in India, I'm sure you've heard of it. Last year, actually, they have thousands of angel investors, thousands of companies that are listed on their platform. In 2019, they did more than 1 investment every week, and you can raise up to $1 million on this platform through a crowdfunding model. And then we have Alok Mittal, who's the co-founder of Indify Technologies. But actually, Alok is here because he's one of India's most active angel investors. He's also one of the founding members of the Indian Angel Network. Indian Angel Network is the largest angel network in the world, and was actually previously a venture capitalist. So was actually co-led a firm called Kanan Partners, which is very, very active for quite a period of time. So he's quite unique in that very active angel, part of India's largest angel network, was formerly at VC, and now is actually an entrepreneur who's raised a fair bit of capital. Indify is one of India's most interesting fintech companies. And then I will represent Surge. So I'll be there both as a moderator, but also as somebody who'll be able to talk about sort of stories from the trenches, right? In terms of how do angels, platforms like Let's Venture and Indian Angel Network, as well as VC firms that I'll represent, actually select which companies we want to invest in, what do we look for founders, what kind of ideas or themes that we would like, and also examples of what works and what doesn't work at each of these stages from as far as these set of investors are concerned. So please do join us next Saturday, again, 4 p.m. India Standard Time. And for the last thing we'll say before we take the last few questions on Surge is, if you missed the first part 1 of the series, please do please do go and watch the Surge Part 1 series, right? So we've got at the bottom of that slide, you can see where you can go. It's only 90 minutes. Go take a look at it. If you're a seed stage startup, I think you'll enjoy watching it. Last thing is, if you are actually in the process of trying to raise your seed round, we'd love to hear from you. All you have to do is go to surgeahead.com/apply, and you can apply to Surge. And hopefully between the last week's session and this week's session and the next 2 sessions we're going to have, we would have told you everything you need to know to apply to Surge and actually make a very compelling pitch to Surge. So with that, thank you for joining us. And then Peter and I, for those of you that asked a few questions on Surge, we're going to stay back and answer a couple of those questions.
Fantastic. Thank you. So a couple of questions on the kind of businesses that Surge is interested in. Folks asking, do we look at tech-only businesses? What kind of startups are a good fit? Are we sector agnostic?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start and then Peter can add. Look, we basically focus on tech and tech-enabled companies, but it's a pretty broad spectrum of companies, right? So they go from consumer internet, online, offline, tech-enabled businesses, right? Co-living, things like that. We look at e-commerce companies. We look at B2B commerce companies, like for instance, Telio, which Peter talked about, which is Vietnam's leading B2B e-commerce company. We've done B2B e-commerce investments in India. We look at SaaS companies, right? All forms of SaaS, enterprise SaaS, SMB SaaS, dev tools companies, ad tech companies. And then finally, we look at direct-to-consumer brands. So in every cohort, we've had at least one, in some cases, 2 direct-to-consumer brands. In fact, this cohort of Surge, we have a company called Drink Prime, which is a water subscription, a startup focused on water subscription. They're based in Bangalore. We have a company called Nat Habit in Delhi, which is actually in the which is a direct-to-consumer brand, and so on. In Indonesia, we have basically a cloud food brand. It's called Hangry. So lots of focus on sort of direct-to-consumer brands. And then lastly, we also have made deep tech investments, right? So we invested in a company called Log9 that is focused on developing aluminum-based fuel cells. So it's a broad spectrum. So think of it as tech and tech-enabled businesses. So if your business is actually leveraging tech in an important way, that's the kind of startup that we would want to look at. If you're, let's say, an example of, if you want to build, let's say, a business that has no tech or no tech whatsoever, that's probably not the kind of company that we're going to look at Surge.
Yeah. One more question. Sorry, Peter, did you want to ask something?
No, nothing to add. Good summary.
Okay. One more question. Do we need a registered company to apply to Surge, or can a group, a pair of individuals pitch an idea and then form a company from scratch? And I'll just add on to this because I recall somebody else asking earlier in the chat saying, what would make you invest in just an idea when there are already so many companies which are already in the market and present with data and customers? So I think if we add those on, what would make you invest in an idea, and does Surge consider individuals who are just pitching an idea?
Yeah, I think I'll go and Peter can add. Look, I think we would want to see, and by the way, if it's a single founder trying to build a company, I think there were questions on that. That's perfectly fine, by the way. In our current cohort, we have several startups that are single founder startups, right? Vivek, who's the founder of Pentester, which is a super interesting company in sort of security, online education, if you will, focused on security, starting with pen testers. Nelly, who's the founder of Tiger Hall, right? So as a single founder startup, we are totally fine. We think over a period of time, having co-founders does help in a startup's journey, but we are fine, right? We have invested in companies that are pre-launch, but they are companies, right? So I would say, and by the way, company doesn't have to be incorporated, but it needs to be. So let's say you're a founder, you've just come out of, there is amazing founder product fit. You know exactly, the kind of space that you're going to go after. You are deep in that space. You've got incredible insights. You know what you're going to build, but you haven't launched it yet. You haven't incorporated your company yet. You should talk to us. However, if you're a founder who's now just trying to figure out, okay, I'm not sure exactly what I want to build, but I'm going to look at these 3-4 types of ideas and we'll figure out what I'm going to build, that you're probably not ready for Surge. So one of those founders is ready, one of those founders is not, because we do want you to come to Surge when you're very clear on what you want to build. Now, a lot of our founders, startups, after they come to Surge, by working with us, we will change the model and we'll kind of refocus and so on and so forth, right? So I just wanted to answer it in both those ways. Look, it's very clear. It is never to apply to search, right? It's never too early to apply to search. As I said, 6 out of 20 companies that were in our second cohort of search were pre-launched when we decided to partner with them. They had not launched a product, but they all were very, very clear on what they were going to build. And they had all of those 6 companies had extraordinary founder product fit. And that's really, really important. So if you're thinking about applying to search at that stage, right, where it's a single person, no company yet, you've got an idea, ask yourself this question based on what you've heard from Peter today, what you heard from me last week. Do you believe you have founder product fit? And if the answer to that is yes, and you have very deep insight around the problem you're going to solve, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. And maybe one thing to add, right? Because we always talk about a founder, but we also talk about the rest of the team. It can be a single founder and it can be pre-launch. But again, we talk here today about the pitch to investors, but the other thing is the pitch to candidates and prospective employees. There's another example of a company in Search 2 that was a single founder pre-launch, but he had been able to convince 2 or 3 other really strong operators to actually join his company. So he was solo founder, he was pre-launch, but it gave us comfort that he was already able to articulate his vision of what he wanted to be building and actually convince folks that were in very good jobs and had an amazing background to join him on the journey. And so that was also a sign of confidence, and I think valuable for us as well to back, not just, there's a difference between a solo founder and a one person company, right? And so, yeah.
All right. I think we are well over time, and that's it for the questions from my side.
Yeah, actually, Payal, there's another question. Never too early for search, but is it too late to apply for search, like age of co-founder? Look, it is never too early, or as far as age goes, it's never too late. Now, obviously, if you've raised $20 million and Series B capital, you're probably too late for search, right? But we're a seed stage firm. But look, we have founders who are early 20s all the way up. So don't worry about that at all, right? Again, we're looking for awesome founding teams who really can go out and build very large companies.
Hi, just to jump in, I just spotted somebody else saying, where can they learn about the art of storytelling? And I just wanted to tell our audience, Peter actually does a very cool session on the art of storytelling, and we do it quite frequently. So keep an eye out on our social media pages, and the next time we announce it, you can sign up as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and also just Praveen, don't worry, apply. You're very much in the zone. I just saw your question. That was a question that I just answered a while back.
All right,
okay.
We are a wrap.
Terrific. Thank you, Payal. Thank you very much, Peter, for joining us, and thanks everyone for being with us today. Gautam, I don't know whether you're still there, but I wanted to wrap again by thanking all of you for joining, but also thanking Startup India for this terrific partnership that we have. Looks like, Gautam, we had another record day. Lots of interest in how to raise your seed round. And for those, everybody who joined us, please do join us next Saturday as well. Gautam, over to you to wrap it up.
Thank you so much, Rajan and Peter. You've been able to condense so much information in such a small session. I'm sure the audience is going to walk with a lot of more information today. And I look forward to everybody to join the next session, like next Saturday, like Rajan mentioned. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.